All right, so we'll be back in just a moment. All right, welcome back. We are joined here in the studio by Sabra Ayers, international journalist extraordinaire who's written for the LA Times, Al Jazeera America, for the New Republic, as we have on the screen now, and who is leaving us, which makes us sad. We've had you on the show. You've hosted the show, so that's always exciting. But we also wanted to talk to you because there are a lot of journalists starting to leave Ukraine. There's less media interest. People are focusing on other topics. So we wanted to do a little bit of a retrospective as well.
Sure, yeah.
And you're also a real specialist in Ukraine because you did Peace Corps here, right?
I did 20 years ago. 20 years ago.
So before it was cool.
Before Ukraine was cool. I like to be a trendsetter. I can't say I am not the start of the trend now of a lot of journalists who are beginning to leave Ukraine, which I think is a sad.
Well, why are they leaving? I mean,
well, for me, I'm a freelancer, so it's a matter of sort of, well, it's a personal choice also, because I want to move on to some other things. But I think for a lot of people who are sort of contracted correspondents or those that are sort of contracts with other organizations, they are beginning to refocus their attention in terms of the news cycle. And a lot of it's coming out of Moscow, and I think a lot more people are sort of moving that way. So as a freelancer, the business has become difficult, which for me and personally has worked because I want to do some other things, but
it's an interesting topic because, you know, there was very little international coverage of Ukraine before Maidan. Exactly. Then it started to peak. Then you had all these correspondents coming from Moscow, which on the one hand was good because they spoke Russian, maybe unlike the correspondents from Brussels or elsewhere, but on the other hand was limiting because they didn't speak Ukrainian and weren't necessarily very familiar with Ukraine.
Yeah, that's true. And I've always thought, and I've been a Moscow correspondent myself, but I've always sort of felt very connected to Ukraine because Ukraine was the first country in the former Soviet Union where I lived and sort of got to know this sort of...
This is during Peace Corps?
Yeah, Peace Corps.
So where were you based when you did Peace Corps?
I was in Kharkiv, which is, you know, where Shevchenko is buried, so everyone should visit the Shevchenko grave. But that was 20 years ago when Ukraine was a very, very different country. And so when I moved to Moscow, I always saw, you know, Russia issues from a Ukraine perspective, and I think that what we've seen in the coverage of Ukraine for years since the breakup of the Soviet Union is Moscow correspondents that come down and report on Ukrainian issues from a Moscow point of view, and I've always sort of tried not to do that, particularly during the last 2 years when Ukraine has been, you know, a leader in the news and certainly what's happening in this.
So then, how it makes it different, and using this time probably would remind what are the most important topics, because it's for the freelancer. It's also very interesting that it's very hard sometimes to do the job, but then you can also do the stories which are not just always assigned by the editor. So you can, you know, be a trendsetter. So will you, you know, let's probably bring some. I probably would like you ask, like, for instance, about this story you've done, and maybe you would remind some. That would be the, you name it yourself.
Yeah. Well, this was a series that I did. This was a really challenging series to do, but we worked with the Black Tulips, which, as you guys know, are the volunteers that go into the east to collect the bodies of dead Ukrainian soldiers that are still in the field or that were not being able. The Ukrainian army was not able to take them out, and then they go through the process of identifying those bodies. So we did a two-part series where we worked first with the Tulips about how they work, why they do it, and then we tracked two bodies, and we tracked down the wives of the two soldiers, and they talked a lot about sort of how the war had affected them. They were from Zhytomyr region. It was really fascinating. Both wives had different stories about why their husbands had, one had been in the Ukrainian army and the other had been mobilized. So it was a great series. It sort of tied together, for me, sort of what has happened in Ukraine because of the war and the way it's impacted average Ukrainian lives, and from the volunteers who collected the bodies all the way to a family who lost.
And it's a humanizing story, which is the powerful thing, because when you, I mean, you know, we were talking earlier about the fight between Saakashvili and Avakov, and that blows up, and that's all over the internet. Though no one was actually there to cover it, it's taking stuff that's already there. Yeah. But it doesn't give, there's often a shortage of coverage into the human stories and how people are being affected long-term and on a smaller scale, too.
Yeah.
Sabra, and now, you know, there were a lot of talks about freezing out the conflict. By the way, what we know now, that there is a bit of escalation. It's definitely worse than a couple of weeks ago on the contact line. So there is something to watch out. But when you said, you moved to Ukraine and you started to report it differently, maybe you'd also go how it makes, how this fact, you being in Ukraine, influence on you reporting the places like Debaltseve, being on the separatist side, and maybe you'll get more on this story, for instance.
Well, I think that for me, because I knew Ukraine, I've been coming to Ukraine almost every year for the last 20 years. So to visit, first as a Peace Corps volunteer, then I came back to visit Ukrainian friends almost every year. And so I think for me, with the way I saw this conflict starting, and the accusations there were regional problems in Ukraine, that they were split by the language. I guess I saw that very much as being manipulated and manufactured. I saw this as very much as a manufactured war. And I think that because I understood the background of what Ukraine was like, I was able to sort of look at how the residents in the East were affected by it differently from the way they were affected in central and western Ukraine. So I fear now that we're starting to see a lot of datelines for Ukrainian stories with a Moscow dateline, and that always worries me because.
So that, for instance, therefore you'll do the stories like that, on the, because that was a big story probably on the, because of the whole hype on the far right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so maybe we'll get onto this.
Yeah, you mean?
Yeah, there is this story, for instance.
This was when, if you recall, when they, back in, when was it, April, right after there was this sort of, no one really knew if it was real or not, but a letter that was being sent around in Donetsk before the real escalation of the fighting there, and it said something about Jews would have to start registering. I mean, it was a scare tactic. No one really knew who did it, if it was done as a way to make Ukrainians look bad, or if it's done to make the separatists look bad. We never knew. But most of the Jews now have completely left Donetsk. The active community there is very, very small now. So this was sort of a way I mean, this was a typical story about manipulating what was happening in the East, and manipulating people's emotions and reactions through propaganda.
Well, maybe before that, I mean, do you ever follow up with some of these people afterwards? Did any of you catch in touch?
I did try to follow up with, actually that story about the Jewish community in Donetsk, I interviewed the head circumciser for Ukraine.
Wow.
And I have tried to follow up with him, and I haven't been able to find him, but he is around. I think that he is the guy who actually goes around Ukraine and doesn't circumcise just Jewish babies, but adult Jewish males who are becoming more
religious,
want to get more in touch with their Jewish heritage and choose to be circumcised when they're older, which
is a lot of work.
Not the same as you can imagine, not the same procedure.
So there was a big buzz when there was, if we can use this word, when there was a really open conflict where there was a lot of fight, but currently many people are writing about the reforms. It's also, more or less the same article for the last year. Are there reforms too slow? So what is your way? What was your way, and what you would advise to do while reporting on the reforms? Like, that one's probably on the police.
Yeah, that was, I did it in the summer, right? The police have gotten a lot of attention, and I think it's one of the reforms. It's easy to write about it, easy to focus on. I think, though, I would never say that Ukraine is. I mean, I think that as journalists, particularly you guys working at a local level here, should still be pushing the government to do more and more for the reforms and to keep on their back. That's our job. That's part of our role in democracy as journalists, right? But I do think that I think that people don't recognize how far Ukraine actually has come and how much has actually changed here. And I think that the pessimism that we're seeing now is somewhat not fair. I mean, I guess I'm still optimistic that Ukraine is going in the right direction, and that things have changed here so significantly that it won't slip back to the way it was.
All right. Well, it's great to get your perspective over a number of years and to hear your own observations with that. We wish you well.